It was a spring evening in Interstate Park, which spans the Wisconsin and Minnesota border. Two groups of fishermen on opposite sides of the St. Croix River began arguing across the water. For hours, insults and curse words were exchanged. As the sun went down, patience wore thin, and tempers began to flare. The two groups of men would find themselves on the same side of the river, squaring off, and one fisherman, a young father to 5 children, would not leave the park alive. Hi everyone, I'm Kevin, and this is Just Thought Lounge. Today we're taking a look at a case that is very deceiving on its face. With limited physical evidence, this crime was pieced together from eyewitness testimony, a task made more difficult by the circumstances. Witnesses with inherent bias, a struggle that was over in seconds, and the killing occurred in the dark of the night. Let's take a look. A call was placed to 911 at 9:45 p.m. on the 15th of April, 2015. The call originated from the parking lot on the Wisconsin side of Interstate Park, a sprawling 1,500-acre state park stretching across the Wisconsin-Minnesota border. The caller was Ross Leckman, and he was struggling to perform CPR on his best friend and fishing buddy, 34-year-old Peter Kelly. Before collapsing, Pete had told his friend, "I've been stabbed." When the first officer arrived on the scene, it was a struggle to locate Ross and Pete in the dark of the night. Eventually, they did so, and an ambulance soon followed. Peter Kelly was rushed to the hospital but succumbed to his injuries. He passed away at roughly 10:35 p.m. that same night. Pete had sustained a single stab wound to the left side of his chest. It had penetrated his heart. Peter, or Pete Kelly, had been a local resident of St. Croix Falls his entire life. He graduated from St. Croix Falls High School in 1998 and attended Rochester Community College. Pete married his wife Christy in Las Vegas in 2006, and the couple went on to have 5 children. After 4 sons, they welcomed the last addition, a daughter, to the family only 1 year before his death. His passion, aside from his family, lay in outdoor and active pursuits. Pete enjoyed hunting, fishing, trapping, wrestling, and football. He was also a very involved father. A few years earlier, he had been named Wisconsin's Youth Wrestling Coach of the Year. Friends recounted how he'd be up at 4 a.m. for work, followed by volunteer wrestling practice, and then support a youth program from 6 to 8. His death, so unexpected, and leaving behind 5 children under the age of 9, was devastating to his family and the community. In the light of day, police assessed the scene in the parking area. One vehicle, driven by Pete Kelly and Ross Leckman, remained. Its back window broken, the glass scattered across the pavement. A nearby wooden post had been hastily broken. It appeared to be the implement used to bust the glass. There was a blood trail from where Pete had been lying on the ground to where the assailant's car had been parked. It appeared that he had been stabbed either in the vehicle or very near to it. A cell phone was left on the ground. Investigators had Ross walk them through the scene. They learned that following the altercation, he had searched for a means to access Pete's car in a panic. He did not have the keys. He could not locate them on Pete, and the only cell phone was locked inside the car. With no time to spare, Ross had given up on the keys, broken a wooden post, and then smashed the back window of the car in order to call 911 to help his friend. In the woodland nearer to the road exit, police also found a backpack containing, amongst other related items, small amounts of marijuana. A second small bag of the drug was also found nearby. On one of the picnic tables by the river, they retrieved a Walmart receipt. They were able to trace the receipt to a fishing license purchased by a teenager in Asante, a small town about 45 minutes away in Minnesota. Ross detailed to investigators how he and his best friend had come face to face with a group of 4 younger men. That night, Pete and Ross chose to go fishing on the Minnesota side of the St Croix River. When his schedule allowed, Pete was known to fish after work upwards of 3 to 4 times a week. It was usually a relaxing and pleasant way to wind down after a day of work. Ross packed 8 bottles of alcoholic cider. Beginning at 6:30 p.m. and over the next few hours, each of them had 4 drinks. Ross told police that the 2 men began encountering problems with another group of fishermen shortly after arriving. A large group of younger men, teenagers, or perhaps men in their early 20s, were fishing and socializing just across the water. The group, which he estimated at one point numbered as high as 10 to 15 individuals, were loud. The language they used was vulgar and offensive. Their behavior was obnoxious. The St. Croix River, though it stretches roughly 600 feet across, is nonetheless clear of any obstructions. Sound carries easily. That night, from across the water, Ross recalled hearing profanity and insults, which he and Pete perceived to be directed at them. The insults and mocking hurtful language instigated a verbal exchange between the 2 groups that continued on and off for hours. As the sun went down, the older men caught the distinct smell of marijuana in the air. They yelled across again at the younger men to quiet down. The response they received, Ross said, was essentially to shut up. As they packed up to leave, they heard 1 or 2 more insults. They yelled back over to the group of disrespectful youths that they would be driving over to see them shortly. "See you then," was the response from across the water. Pete and Ross drove over the US 8 bridge to Wisconsin. The time that had elapsed between the last verbal exchange and their arrival on the other side of the park was between 40 minutes to over an hour later. Recollections vary. Pete parked their vehicle between 100 to 150 yards from the group of younger men whom they planned to confront. Then they walked towards where the group could be heard. After assessing that there were only a handful of the group left, not 10 or 15 of them, Ross and Pete announced their presence. A verbal exchange took place, more insults, more cursing. The interaction moved slowly towards a car owned by one of the younger men. As they squared off, Ross claimed one of them pulled out a knife.
You're going to bring a knife out when we're trying to talk to you guys about, respect and fishing?
Ross told police that he was distracted for 3 or maybe 4 seconds when the stabbing itself had occurred. He recalled that afterwards, Pete ran from the car and away from the man with the knife. Then the younger men drove off in 2 separate vehicles. Ross was left in the dark, unable to clearly see where his injured friend was, and without a phone to call for help. Police released a request to the public for assistance. They sought 4 young men in their late teens or early 20s. One of their vehicles was described as a blue Chevrolet S10 pickup, standard cab with a cover over the bed. The other vehicle was vaguely described as a mid to small size passenger car. The press release stated that one of them and a dog named Gunner fled the scene in the Chevy S10 pickup. The Walmart receipt had led investigators to a teenager who had not been at the park on the night in question, but had been there 3 days earlier. This teen knew the group that usually spent time there. He also knew a dog named Gunner. It was not difficult at that point to connect the dots. Once the word was out, an attorney called the Polk County District Attorney to report their client had been involved in the incident. 19-year-old Levi Acre-Kendall admitted to stabbing Peter Kelly that night in the park. His mother turned over the knife and the clothing that her son had been wearing. His 3 friends, Jacob Mosberg, Stephen Phillips, and Hank Michaels, were witnesses. They were all willing to cooperate. Levi was arrested and initially charged with first-degree reckless homicide. Later, additional charges, including second-degree intentional homicide, would be added to the list pending against him. The 19-year-old did not have a troubled or violent past. He had recently graduated from high school and had set to work full-time. His friends ranged in age from 17 to 19. Levi may not have been a typical troublemaker, but he was by most accounts a smartass. He was known amongst his friends as the strongest of them. Levi spoke his mind and didn't tolerate being pushed around, they said. Forensic scientists with the Wisconsin State Crime Lab found that Pete Kelly's blood was spattered across the roof, interior windshield, dashboard, and front passenger door and window of Hank Michael's car. Several bloodstains inside the Toyota Camry were cast-off stains, that is, stains flung from a bloody object, likely Levi's knife, and were deposited from inside the car while the front passenger door was closed. However, a few bloodstains on the very edge of the front passenger door were deposited when the door was open. Investigators, piecing together the exact sequence of events, based largely upon Ross Lechman's retelling, deduced that the cast-off stains inside the car were deposited from after the stabbing had taken place. They were likely made by the young men once back in the car, and the bloodied knife was still held in Levi's hand. The location of the stains also supported information provided by the teens. At one point during the incident, the passenger side door was open. During the few seconds that Ross Lechman claimed to have looked away, Levi's friends claimed they watched as Levi sat down inside the car. He was getting ready to leave the park, and the heated encounter. Pete Kelly, they said, leaned into the vehicle and forcefully pulled Levi out. The two struggled, and within seconds, the knife that Levi was holding had pierced Pete's heart. The assertion that the stabbing had occurred during the act of removing Levi from the car seemed to be consistent with the blood evidence. This scenario introduced a clear path for the defense, applying Wisconsin's Castle Doctrine. This law extends a presumption of immunity to individuals who use deadly force in self-defense against someone who forcibly enters their home, motor vehicle, or place of business. Crucially, unlike just across the border in Minnesota, the Wisconsin law applies to vehicles. Levi's new attorney, Eric Nelson, argued Levi was attempting to get away from Pete Kelly. He moved to have the charges dismissed.
Mr. Acre-Kendall was seated in the motor vehicle at the time that Mr. Kelly reached into the motor vehicle in an assaultive manner, trying to remove him from the motor vehicle.
The motion may have succeeded, but for one clause. The Castle Doctrine does not allow for lethal force to be used while committing a crime. The knife that Levi used, ostensibly as his fishing knife, was a switchblade. It was an expensive one, but more importantly, it was an illegal knife. The motion to dismiss was denied. Levi Acre-Kendall would go to trial at the end of 2015. Levi Acre-Kendall was facing up to 60 years if he was found guilty of either of the initial two charges against him. The first was second-degree intentional homicide. If the jury was not convinced that Levi meant for Pete to die when he stabbed him, they could still find him guilty of a different charge, first-degree reckless homicide. That is, if the state could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that his actions under the circumstances showed an utter disregard for human life. When jury selection began, it was from a pool of individuals outside of Polk County. The decision was made by Judge Gail Wyrick, who cited the case's severity, extensive media coverage, and the local renown of the victim, Pete Kelly. The judge expressed significant concerns over whether Levi could get a fair trial with local jurors. Indeed, the media coverage had not just been plentiful, but was also provided rapidly, in some cases before many of the details of the incident had been verified. Some outlets falsely reported that the young men had been the ones to cross the state border seeking a fight, not the victim and his friend, which was in fact the case. This small alteration of the facts painted the younger men as the overt aggressors. Defense attorney Eric Nelson argued the opposite. Levi used the knife only when violently pulled from his friend's car. It was an act of self-defense. Prosecutor Dan Steffen argued that it was not reasonable for Levi to have feared for his life in the scuffle.
It must have been a reasonable belief that the force used was necessary to prevent death. Well, we all know what death is. Or great bodily harm.
The first witness to take the stand was Ross Leckman. Ross had more to reveal in court testimony than he had conveyed to police during his initial interview. He admitted that he and Pete parked a notable distance away from Levi's group and approached them in the dark because they did not want to be detected. Pete had made the decision to keep his vehicle further away to prevent it from being vandalized, he said. In Ross's initial interview, he omitted a piece of information, an action that he was not proud of. Following the initial exchange of words, swearing and insults, Ross admitted to knocking Levi to the ground, moving the verbal altercation to a physical one very quickly after the groups first came face to face. As the 19-year-old rose to his feet, he pulled the switchblade from his pocket. When the three friends took the stand, they explained how the dispute began from across the river. They were just joking around, they said, admittedly, quite loudly. The entire incident, they said, was sparked by a YouTube video. The teenagers started laughing and joking about a D's Nuts video they watched on a cell phone.
Oh, because some came in the mail today.
Yeah, I did.
These nuts. Got him! Got him!
They were repeating back the jokes when they heard one of the men across the river yell out to them, "You think that's funny?" followed by an expletive. From the teens' perspective, the older men instigated the argument. For the older men, it was the loud teenagers hurling insults.
They yelled across, saying, "You think you're real funny." And that's when they yelled loud enough so we would all hear them.
The yelling and insults only escalated from there. Just over 3 hours later, Pete Kelly and Ross Leckman were driving over the state border. Stephen Phillips was standing near to Levi when the encounter with the older men began. The other two teenagers, Jake Mossberg and Hank Michaels, also testified that they did not see the actual stabbing, but observed other portions of the exchange. Stephen told the jury that when Ross tossed Levi to the ground, he became scared.
I was really scared because Levi had kind of been like the strongest one out of all of us, and some guy had just tossed him around so easily.
Accounts and details from the three friends varied. Jake Mossberg testified that it was Pete, not Ross, who ran at a full-on charge and tackled Levi. Ross himself testified that it was him. According to Jake, Levi stood up from being knocked over, brandished the knife, and retreated to Michael's car as Pete pursued him. Jake further testified that Levi had a scared look on his face.
I'm just going to say what I seen. I seen Kelly tackle Levi to the ground. They got back up. Levi pulled the knife. They separated. Oh, you're pulling a knife. You must be from cities or something.
Each of the witnesses, including Ross Leckman, recalled different language, cursing, and insults being thrown back and forth. No one denied that both groups used offensive and abrasive language. The insults mainly centered around gay slurs and questioning the strength and masculinity of the other group. Occasionally, they would accuse the other of being from the city. Hank Michaels admitted that Levi had been antagonizing Pete in the verbal exchange by repeating back to the older man every statement that he made. "You think you're a tough guy?" To which Levi would say, "Yeah, I'm a tough guy." Hank testified that he believed that this back and forth only made Pete Kelly more angry. Having been pushed to the ground, Levi stood up with the knife. At that point, Hank tried to step between the two and defuse the situation, but Pete rebuffed the attempt. It was just escalating, Hank testified, adding that when Levi produced the knife, that action actually escalated instead of de-escalating the confrontation.
Kind of made Kelly back off a little bit, but it made him angrier.
It seemed as though a fight was going to break out, Hank said. He showed the jury how he remembered Pete had grabbed Levi and pulled him from the car. It was a messy struggle that lasted only moments before it was over.
It was chaotic. I mean, Levi was freaking out. He didn't know what he just did.
After the stabbing, Hank, Levi, and Steven got in the Camry to leave. In a panic, they dumped a backpack in the woodland on their way out of the park and drove back to Minnesota. Levi Acre-Kendall took the stand to tell his side of the story. He had been visibly upset in the courtroom throughout the previous testimony, particularly when Christy Kelly took the stand to speak of her husband and the loss felt by her and their children. Levi testified that he did not know which of the older men had knocked him to the ground. It was too dark and it happened too quickly.
I kind of went down on all fours and kind of sort of caught myself with my hands and just kind of popped back up.
After pulling out the knife, he told the men confronting him, "Get out of here." They responded by taunting him about bringing a knife to a fist fight. "You're a big man with a knife," is the language he recalled hearing. He told the jury that he had stated, "I don't want to fight." He said he held his knife in front of him to keep the men away. They backed up, but they weren't really scared, he said.
I was even more scared because they weren't fazed by it. I mean, I was intimidated.
Levi told the jury that the men continued to taunt him and seemed to get angrier. He said Pete Kelly continued to confront him. "He kept lunging at me and faking me out. He said, 'You kids aren't even worth my time.' To which Levi claims to have responded, 'Okay, we'll leave.' After pulling his knife, the 19-year-old had moved along the passenger side of Hank's Toyota Camry. Reaching the front passenger door, which he had opened, he sat down inside. According to Levi, Pete Kelly then pulled him out.
I was scared as hell. I felt like I was doomed. This is it.
Why did you stab him?
He said he was going to beat me up. I wish I could take it all back. I wish I could change it. I'm so sorry.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
In cross-examination, the state questioned Levi on the details of the struggle.
You sit down in the car, you got your knife, and you say, "You're a real badass."
Yeah.
And in response to that, you claim that Mr. Kelly says, "Yeah, I am," and flexes.
Yeah, he said, "You want to feel a real man's muscle."
Okay? And that's when Mr. Michaels tries to intervene.
Yeah.
And we heard testimony from everybody that everybody was standing up at this time. But your testimony is that you were actually seated when that intervention or attempted intervention took place.
I was definitely seated, yes.
Just as Hank had testified, after the attempted intervention, Pete dismissed Hank.
Mr. Kelly says, "Just get out of here. Just leave."
He said, "Get back over there, you lanky mother."
Okay? And then after Mr. Michaels leaves, doesn't Mr. Kelly tell you guys to just get out of there?
He said, "You aren't worth my time. Just get out of here."
Just get out of here. And isn't that kind of a repeated theme throughout this night? He's saying, "You guys just go, just get out of here."
Yeah.
Prosecutor Dan Steffen had Levi reenact the motion he took after being pulled from the car. Unlike the demonstration offered by Hank, in which both men stood eye to eye, Levi demonstrated being held down by the neck. He testified that he saw only their feet as he swung the knife. Levi showed how he had stabbed Pete. He was then asked where the knife made contact. Levi testified that at that time, he did not know where he had stabbed Pete Kelly. It all happened too fast.
Okay, show me the motion you make when you stab Mr. Kelly.
I was down like this, and I just went like this.
So you know you didn't stab him in the leg. You just showed the jury a motion of how you stabbed him, correct?
I guess if I thought about it.
And sit back down. From the time of the stabbing, how many seconds?
I couldn't tell you.
Less than a minute?
Yeah. It was less than 10. It was less than 5, but I mean, it was, I couldn't tell you exactly. It was
Less than 10, less than 5 what?
seconds. It just happened quickly. I don't know.
So is it your testimony that from the time you got grabbed by the back of your neck to the time you stabbed Mr. Kelly was less than 5 seconds?
It could have been.
I'm trying to narrow it down here.
I couldn't tell you, like I said before, but it was fairly quick. It was very quick.
It's fairly quick. It was very quick. Was it less than 10 seconds?
Yeah.
The Midwest Medical Examiner's Office had found that the stab wound that killed Peter Kelly went through his ribs directly into his heart. The severity of the wound assured that it would have been fatal, even if Pete had been stabbed while at a hospital. Michael Madsen of the Medical Examiner's Office testified that Pete's blood alcohol content was 0.043 at the time his blood was tested, half the legal limit of intoxication. Defense attorney Eric Nelson suggested that Pete's blood alcohol level would have been higher at the time of the fatal confrontation. Nelson argued that Pete's judgment had been impaired. The teenagers also admitted to smoking marijuana earlier in the evening. No one, it seemed, had been of sober mind at the time of the encounter. The medical examiner also determined the angle of the stab wound. The knife entered in an upwards trajectory, left to right, into the chest. For the prosecution, a key component of the case rested in the actions taken by the teens after the altercation itself. They fled the scene. On the way back towards Cambridge, Minnesota, they passed not one but 2 police cruisers. They did not contemplate stopping to report what had happened. Indeed, they could have sought emergency assistance en route or called 911, but did not.
Their thought processes were to cover this up, cover up what they were doing, get the heck out of there. Driving down Highway 8, they see that officer in the gas station. They don't stop. They get on 95. They see that trooper with lights and siren. They don't stop. They never call 911. Not before this happens, not while it's happening, not after it's happening, not when they're driving home, not when they get home, not the next day. And why is that important? We harped on that a lot. Why is that important? Because again, consciousness of guilt.
What Levi did do was phone his father. Mr. Kendall did not advise his son to contact 911 immediately. He did so only days later, with the support of an attorney. By that time, the Walmart receipt and other witnesses had already led law enforcement to his son.
Were there bad decisions? Oh, there were bad decisions. There were lots and lots and lots of bad decisions that day. Starting when Mr. Kelly and Mr. Leckman decided to take the law into their own hands.
In closing arguments, both the state and defense would interpret the physical evidence offered by the medical examiner differently. For the state, the trajectory of the knife meant that the struggle did not occur in the way that Levi had stated.
Shoulders. Knife wound up. Eye to eye. This version, looking down at his belly button, reaching around, which we saw the defendant portray, doesn't even fit with the medical evidence that's been presented. It doesn't work. It doesn't fit. From left to right, and at an upward angle. And as Mr. Steffen describes it, he's doing this.
He is taking his arm in a downward stabbing motion, but that's not the gesture that Mr. Acre-Kendall showed you yesterday. That's what he did. Upwards, left to right, front to back.
Finally, and crucially, the state and defense appealed to the jury to sort through and set aside the many minor inconsistencies in the eyewitness accounts. Defense counsel emphasized the need to separate out the many details they deemed to be irrelevant aspects of the testimony, such as what exact insult was used at what time, or whether it was Ross or Pete that Levi understood had thrown him to the ground. To the prosecution, the details mattered.
So he's known at that time, he's on notice at that point in time that I get in an altercation with the bigger guy, I'm going to suffer some scrapes. And when he gets into a second altercation, perhaps, with Pete Kelly, or maybe not, maybe he just does this, but even in the worst case scenario, he gets into a second altercation with Pete Kelly. It is not reasonable to believe that he thought he was either going to imminently die or suffer great bodily harm.
Eric Nelson outlined the events from his client's perspective. Actions, he argued, speak louder than words.
What kind of pussy pulls out a knife? Put the knife down and let's duke it out like a man. That's what Mr. Leckman said, Mr. Kelly said. Put down the knife and let's duke it out like a man. As Mr. Acre-Kendall is walking along the side of the car, he's not swinging his knife. He's not jabbing or trying to poke Mr. Kelly. He's backing up. He's walking sideways. It's Mr. Kelly who's lunging at him and trying to get him to get rid of the knife, to scare him. They were bigger. It was dark. He's immediately thrown to the ground. And so quickly that he couldn't even tell you who it was. And he gets up and he pulls a knife. And the knife doesn't stop this guy. The knife does not de-escalate the situation. It makes it worse. How terrifying is that? That you're holding a knife and saying, I don't want to fight. Want to feel a real man's muscles? He has nowhere to go. The door is now open. He can't even go that way. Mr. Kelly is within arm's reach. And Mr. Leckman is right there, and the car is behind him. Where can he go? You guys can go. Go ahead. Get out of here. Get out of here. But does he let him get out of there? No, he lunges into the car and violently rips Mr. Acre-Kendall from the car.
The first decision before the jury was whether to convict Levi on second-degree intentional homicide. If the stabbing was not intentional, the jury considered first-degree reckless homicide. The final charge to consider was one added just before the deliberations began: second-degree reckless homicide. The same as first-degree reckless homicide, but prosecutors didn't need to show an utter disregard for human life. The jury of 7 women and 5 men deliberated for more than 17 hours over the following weekend. During this time, both sides were working on a plea deal. The deal on the table was for the third count, second-degree reckless homicide. Sentencing would then be placed in the hands of the judge. The charge carries a maximum sentence of 25 years. Levi rejected the deal. For days, the jury was deadlocked 11-1 on a not guilty verdict for this third charge. Then, the jurors reached a consensus.
Has the jury reached a verdict? Would you please hand it to Ms. Donna the bailiff, and then you may be seated. We, the jury, find the defendant, Levi Acre-Kendall, not guilty of second-degree intentional homicide, not guilty of first-degree reckless homicide as indicated in the information as count 2, not guilty of second-degree reckless homicide as indicated in the information as count 3.
Levi Acre-Kendall was found not guilty on all counts.
I am concerned that this sets a real bad precedent for the society that we're in.
If you got a better lawyer and you can afford a better lawyer, you're going to win. You know, obviously in a small town, if you got money to have a lawyer, you're going to be able to do whatever you want, kill someone and get away with it. I know my parents, they're crushed. We're all crushed. Our family will never be the same, and it'll never be over for me.
The person who's responsible for the death of their loved one is not going to be convicted of anything at this point is obviously extremely difficult.
I think that ultimately when the jury was instructed in the law and attempting to that they were instructed to put themselves in his place at that moment, that was a turning point.
Eric Nelson told the media after the verdict that he believed Levi's genuine and honest testimony was the key to showing the jury what really happened that night. The verdict is not an injustice, he said. This was a tragedy, in every way, for every person involved.
Concern is this just invites everybody to pull a knife out at any fist fight or at any bar fight. The bottom line is that this wasn't a fight.
A GoFundMe page for the Kelly family raised over $100,000 to support Pete's family. On the 15th of April, 2015, Christy Kelly became a single mother to 5 children. That was the tragic case of Peter Kelly and Levi Acre-Kendall. If you like the way we tell these stories, then make sure you subscribe for our latest videos. I'm Kevin, this is Just Thought Lounge, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.